Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what is making the headlines with the journalist and author Ian Dunt and the former Conservative Special Advisor Salma Shah. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. Welcome. So let's see what is on some of those front pages. Well, The Guardian's coverage of the Israel-Hamas war focuses on the Israeli raid into Gaza, declaring a new phase of the conflict has started. 200 Britons trapped in Gaza plead for help is the headline of The Times, adding the Prime Minister has promised to do everything possible as border force officials are sent to Egypt. The Telegraph's take on the war, the invitation by Russian President Vladimir Putin for Hamas and Iranian leaders to visit Moscow. And The Eye reports on the arrest of Conservative MP Crispin Blunt on suspicion of rape and possession of controlled substances. The Sun leading with that story as well, with the headline, MP in rape and drugs arrest. Reporting on Rishi Sunak's belief that artificial intelligence poses a threat to humanity, the Metro has the headline, End of the World is AI. And the front page of The Express reports on hope for treatment for dementia, with cases in the UK set to soar in coming years. But the FT has happier news involving the US economy, which has seen a 4.9% increase to its gross domestic product. And finally, the Daily Star's front page, which suggests, quote, grumpy folk are not just having a bad day, they may be suffering a demonic possession. Well, and a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the program, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch with us. And we are joined today by Ian Dunt and Salma Shah. So thank you both for joining us. Unsurprisingly, the Middle East still dominates many of the headlines. So Salma, what stood out for you in the coverage, looking at The Guardian specifically?
So The Guardian, as you mentioned in your summary, has talked about Israeli forces entering a new phase with their raid into Gaza, which they've described as substantial but limited. And this really is changing the pace, I think, of the conflict. You see as well, throughout The Guardian's copy and in other newspapers, calls of potentially the EU leaders asking for humanitarian corridors and a pause, and also questions coming into the US President Joe Biden about what he said to Benjamin Netanyahu about his support and how far that extends if they do decide to go into this ground invasion that everybody is expecting. So lots of movement strategically and politically.
And Ian, as we were mentioning, of course, everyone has been waiting for this ground invasion. Well, Benjamin Netanyahu said as much just yesterday night. But it has been nearly 3 weeks now since the massacre of October 7th. Do you get the sense that public opinion, either in the UK or governments, are slightly shifting their stance on a possible ground invasion?
Public opinion in the UK, I mean, things are quite volatile and highly changeable at the moment. But, I mean, seems quite wary of what is going on, and I think instinctively would be that way. Governments, primarily, the main change that we've seen is this real kind of rallying around the idea of a ceasefire. We've also seen commensurate pressure then on Labour leader Keir Starmer in a manner that you would expect, predominantly from the left of his party, but not exclusively from the left of his party, centrist Labour MPs as well. I find it a bit... there's a sort of certain element to that that's sort of baffling, because you sort of think, like, well, there has to be a counter-offer. If that's going to be a serious proposal to Israel, there has to be a counter-offer that says, OK, fine, ceasefire. But you also have to explain how Israel is going to get the thing that it needs, which is to make sure that Hamas cannot do this again. You know, it cannot just be this thing of, like, you stop now, there's no more to talk about. So, therefore, the conversation which actually Labour and the government are much closer to, which is, well, there can be temporary cessations, and, you know, we can make sure we get humanitarian aid in there, and then we'll see what happens once the cessation is there. That seems a more realistic conversation to have.
I think the interesting thing about this conversation is, you know, Keir Starmer is being asked to take a position, but the leader of the opposition, indeed the British Prime Minister, is not actually able to shift the dial on this. The most critical thing right now, from Israel's perspective, is to bring those hostages back. And indeed, it is for other world leaders, Britain's included, are part of that hostage group. And they are going to be in Gaza. So this is a very complex situation where you are trying to extract a huge number of people with severe conditions who are essentially being used as leverage. I mean, you'll see in the coverage as well in The Guardian that Iran is talking about potentially acting as a mediator between the hostages at the moment as well. So it is incredibly complex. And even though there's a lot of pressure being put on the Labour leader to talk about a ceasefire, ultimately, you know, he has no power to do it, and nor can anyone act unilaterally.
It's spot on. There's a sort of parochial sense to the British debate, which is, you know, this like, well, we'll just talk about our stuff, because we know that Britain has no influence in this matter. You know, Israel doesn't really care about what any other country says, apart from the US, if anyone at all.
Except there is now a lot of attention on the humanitarian situation in Gaza, which is the focus of the Times. I think page 6 and 7, the headline here, Israel accused of weaponizing hunger as food stocks dwindle. Ian.
Yeah, so these are aid agencies with some really quite robust rhetoric, as you've just outlined, about what's going on in Gaza. The report is really strong, and I mean, the report is actually looking in quite minute detail, for instance, about what is it like to be a Gazan just trying to get bread. You know, lots of bakeries have now been bombed. What is the process of trying to get food for your family? 5-hour waits, that sense of danger and exposure and vulnerability during that moment. And I think as well, by looking at those words, weaponizing hunger, you get a sense of how acute the rhetoric and the emotional sort of fragility is around this issue and how intense it could be over the next few weeks and, unfortunately, months.
Because they really are running out of everything.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a quote here that really stuck out to me from Reham Jafari, who's from ActionAid in Palestine, who says, those who survive the bombings may die from starvation instead. And I think this is, you know, this is war. These are going to be difficult tactics. Hamas does embed itself within the civilian population. And I think we're going to see some very shocking, very harrowing, continued shocking and harrowing pictures coming out of Gaza.
OK. Slightly move away from the story in the Middle East, focusing on something here in the UK. And Rishi Sunak here, front page of the Metro. End of the world is AI. So, you know, you're an AI optimist or a pessimist?
Neither. I can't.
You couldn't care less.
No, because I can't work out what they're talking about. And it seems that he is talking in exactly the same way as everybody else when they pop on the radio or the TV. They sort of come on and they're like, everything's going to get easier, we're going to make loads of more money, and also possibly everyone's going to die.
Yeah.
No, we might all die, but also, you know, jobs will be easier, and, you know, something's going to happen to paralegals now. You know, the computer's going to do it instead. And the document that was put out by the government is a bit more beefy and substantial and interesting. Sunak's speech itself is just that again. It's just like, oh, by the way, lots of good stuff, maybe complete, you know, existential catastrophe, but also maybe good stuff. And I sort of think, I don't really know. I read the speech and just thought I honestly felt quite a lot stupider than I was.
So you don't go on ChatGPT and put random questions in to see what comes up?
I did it once and I felt very, very lonely.
What did you ask?
I asked a series of questions as to what I should do on my holiday. Why am I letting the machine dictate for me what happens to me in Barcelona?
OK, fair enough. Salma.
So I have to say, I think this is very interesting for two reasons. One, it is a huge global issue, and he is saying all the right things in terms of trying to understand how one future-proofs against this kind of technology, because he rightly says, you know, you could end up with making it easier to build chemical or biological weapons. There are some serious implications. We're not there right now. Yeah. But what is actually really strange about this, a year out from an election cycle, is that none of this has any electoral salience. So it's very interesting to have a Prime Minister who is such a policy wonk. I mean, he's very clever. Nobody ever denies this. But thinking about it in terms of being potentially a year out from an election, let's see.
Very clever is the most generous thing I've ever heard anyone say about Rishi Sunak.
He's very clever.
But a lot of people do fear they're going to lose their jobs to AI. So wouldn't that have some political clout?
Except until they realise it, you know, ChatGPT is sort of a little bit of fun for most people. And I've never used it, but people who have tell me that it's amazing and it's brilliant and it does all these great things. But when you're looking at, you know, a difficult economic situation, when you're looking at public services not performing as well as they should be, if you've got the Prime Minister making a big speech about AI, it feels slightly incongruous, I think, with where the rest of the country is at the moment.
OK. You don't think it's a good idea to at least raise the profile? Because in fairness, none of us seem to be experts on it and we don't use it very much. But, you know, it does seem to be one of the big game changers coming up.
It absolutely is. I think the Prime Minister has to be realistic about how much Britain can drive it themselves. So until we see big US presence coming in to talk about AI regulation and tech regulation, because let's not forget, the people who are most advanced on this are American companies in terms of, you know, the Googles of the world. We're actually going to struggle to sort of really make the headway if we're thinking about how we governance this and how we create that set of global regulation that's going to actually have any impact on how this technology evolves.
Yeah, I don't know what he's doing. I just don't get... I mean, this is the kind of thing that you would say, right, so this speech would be made by one of the Secretaries of State. Your point, I think, is exactly sound. It's like, why would he wrap himself in it? When really what is demanded of him is what is going on with NHS waiting time.
Because he knows about this stuff probably better than, you know, a lot of people. He wants to talk about it. He cares about it. And it's not a bad thing to talk about. It's actually, in 50 years' time...
And there's a summit next week about it as well.
Exactly. He's hosting this summit next week. He's got a couple of world leaders coming to it, so that's, you know, a start. But in 50 years' time, when this technology is really out there, we're going to be so glad that Rishi Sunak cared about this at this point. It doesn't make sense to us right now, but in 50 years' time, this will all make sense.
I'm not certain that's true.
We'll settle it in 50 years' time. Let's look at the FT now. And the front page there, Shadow Chancellor red-faced as book shows copy lifted from other sources. Ian.
Welcome to, like, the anxiety nightmare of anyone that has ever written a book. So you just look at the stuff and you're like, you feel the shiver go down you. And weirdly, the story is... OK, one thing to speak about is why, in the name of God, are so many politicians writing books? Yeah. Like, they should not have time to be writing these books. I don't even, you know, when the London mayor... These are all politicians I like, by the way. I'm just like, you're supposed to be running the city. Yeah. There shouldn't be time for this. She is the shadow chancellor. I don't see her this time. And evidently, the truth is, she didn't have time and therefore just started copying and pasting from Wikipedia, which I can confirm, as an author, is generally frowned upon. The plagiarism worries me less than the kind of shoddy quality of the research. Because if you're in any position that you were using Wikipedia for your book, like, that is a really problematic statement to have made.
But it's not just it's not just Wikipedia. It's that she didn't basically give credit to some of the people and research that she used. Isn't that right?
Yes, but she's focused most of her attention on the fact that she's taking responsibility for the errors and the plagiarism that's in there. I do think Ian's right that, you know, this sort of profile gathering thing that politicians do in order to kind of make themselves look a little bit more serious by writing books is a little bit silly when she's got so much going on. But I think Rachel Reeves has done such a brilliant job as Shadow Chancellor to sort of talk about Labour as a serious party for business. She's slightly damaged herself a little bit here because, you know, it doesn't seem like she's, you know, all as together as we might have presumed she was.
And we shouldn't exaggerate, by the way. The Tories are trying to make a really severe attack on this, and that is not going to work. No one is going to care, and it's not going to damage Labour's prospects or anything like that. But actually, she has come out of this worse than she went into it.
Welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me now, Ian Dunt and Salma Shah. Thank you both for being with us. OK, let's take a look at the Financial Times. Another story from here, their top story, really. Resilient consumer spending spurs U.S. economy to 4.9% GDP growth. So good news for the U.S. economy. Could Bidenomics work here, Salma?
Well, this is something that the Labour Party is definitely talking about, and Rachel Reeves has done a very good job of saying that this is going to be Labour's economic plan. And this is obviously grist to that mill, because we're talking about consumer confidence coming back, the Fed thinking about not having to raise interest rates further. So it does look good. But, of course, there are going to be... I mean, lots of economists will be shouting at the TV at the moment, sort of talking about the differences between our economies and whether that is still possible here because of the differences in capital that's being circulated around in the UK, consumer confidence and investment. So I think it's going to require a bit more detail from the Shadow Chancellor if we are going to import Bidenomics, as it were.
Well, as a Brit, you look at these numbers and you're like, it's like looking at some other world. You know, you just like, this is just the most preposterous thing. The funny thing is, you look at the polling in the US, and there's really persistent polling that shows people were very unhappy with Biden for his handling of the economy. And you just think, what else could you possibly want from the president but what he's handed you here? I mean, the core difference really is the fact that Britain is going to struggle to borrow the kind of money that the Americans find very easy to borrow, basically because of their currency, but also because of the state of our political debate. Because, you know, essentially Rachel Reeves has had to kind of put a straitjacket around herself with her own fiscal rules. But it is quite noticeable that, you know, if like me, you grew up in the sort of New Labour, Tony Blair, kind of Bill Clinton era, where there was this real aversion to any kind of state intervention in the market. That was considered old hat, 1970s militant trade unionism. That's the language Biden talks. We intervene in the economy. It's proper old-school Keynesianism, really, and it speaks the language of the multiplier, of actually working the economy that way. And that is the kind of language that if you scratch away at some of the more austerity rhetoric around Labour, when you look at the policies, especially on net zero, that's the kind of stuff you see from Labour as well.
OK, but I'm just going to point out to you that one of the criticisms of several Conservative administrations is exactly that they haven't actually well, they've been too interventionist and they haven't allowed the market to really thrive in this situation. I think there are a lot of people who would criticise, certainly post-pandemic, you know, just how much state intervention and how much propping up was done, you know, the levelling up agenda, what George Osborne was doing in advance of that. So, you know, have we already had our version of Bidenomics and it hasn't worked all that well?
I think the other way of looking at that is look at the space that the Conservatives offered Labour on that old issue of the market versus the state by talking about Brexit, by talking about state aid, by talking about levelling up. And suddenly, you know, a centre-left party can go like, OK, so you just opened up that space. Now we can move over here quite significantly. I think we've all probably underestimated the kind of ideological effect of COVID, of seeing the only way we could get through this is the state intervening. Now Labour is going to try and capitalise.
It'd be interesting to see if and how this would impact the US elections, which of course are coming up next year. And it could segue into a story in the Metro, page 16. Trump flouts the gag order again. Trump storms out of fraud trial as he's fined for breaching gag order. Ian.
Yes, it won't surprise you to learn that Donald Trump is storming out of court cases where he's pretty much banged to rights, saying they're all partisan against him, not abiding by the rules that have been set down. I mean, you can sort of write the script yourself for the way that this man behaves at this stage, and he reliably does continue to be the worst possible version of himself.
What's very fascinating about this is that he's talking about habitually exaggerating the value of his assets. And so this is something that's always been... Ian's going to make me laugh now. But this is very interesting because it is about sort of the image that he created for himself as this very successful billionaire. And it's sort of, you know, tarnishing slightly that image. I do think it's very on brand for Donald Trump to flout a court order and, you know, pay a fine for it. So I never quite know if it's something that he's intending to do because it riles the base up or whether it's just somebody who's being very erratic.
Yeah. And of course, I mean, you know, his base, according to many of them, he can do no wrong. Either they're not going to believe it or it's not really going to have an impact on the election. I mean, it's quite interesting seeing at everything that's going on in the Middle East right now, you know. We think it's bad, but then sometimes you think, gosh, if Donald Trump was president of the United States, I guess the situation might prove even maybe more unstable, but certainly maybe a lot of European leaders would feel less confident in a US led by Trump.
Yeah, I think the issue here is that there's a complexity in foreign affairs that we sort of depend on the US to lead us on. You know, it's the previous conversation we had, is that, you know, Biden says something, Israel will listen, not necessarily true for everybody else. But what is fascinating is that you never really know with Trump where you sit, because he was trying to ally himself with President Putin, who has been hosting a delegation with Hamas members in it, you know, just this week. And so, you know, the knock-on effects down on various different policy and geopolitical events is going to be a lot more confusing, I think.